Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Thursday day of training. We have Dr. Adams here with us, and without further ado, we'll go ahead and turn it over to him.
Well, thank you very much. To begin today, let's start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we ask that as we study the Adventist lifestyle, that we may pick up what's good and notice what's particularly not good. Help us to learn to live right and to share this with other people in a winning way. Be with us in this first lecture now, and we ask for the Holy Spirit to guide us in Jesus' name. Amen. So, the Blue Zones is an interesting concept, and it was a word coined by Dan Buettner, and he was working with the National Geographic Society and studying longevity around the world. He was looking for areas where there were many 100-year-old people, and these would be areas where there were low levels of heart disease and cancer. And these were called blue zones because he used a blue marker on the map where these areas were identified, thus the blue zones. This appeared in the National Geographic many years ago, and Dan Buettner has worked this into a whole system of longevity. There's a whole series of books and a whole series of diets and a series of tours around blue zones. And the whole blue zone concept was recently sold to Adventist Health. So Adventists now own the concept of blue zones. But where were the blue zones? One of the blue zones was in Icaria, Greece. And people there are a lot of people 100 years old in that city in Greece. Okinawa, Japan is another blue zone where there are many people living in their 90s and quite a few into their hundreds. And then on the island of Sardinia, there is a town where there are a number of people that have lived to be 100. And then in this hemisphere, on the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica, there is a group of people that have reached a really big advanced age. And the only place in the United States and in North America that's a blue zone is Loma Linda, California. And Loma Linda changed the labels on many of their food products to be blue because of blue zones. And what makes blue zones unique? It's not because there is an individual here and there who lives to be very old, but it's because there is longevity in a population, longevity in a whole group of people. And the characteristics of the blue zones that were outlined by Dan Buettner is that the population is physically active. Many of them are farmers. They're busy from early morning to late at night. They largely eat a plant-based diet, and they all apply the 80% rule, which is you stop eating before you get full. And so you push back while there's still some food on your plate, and you could eat more. Another characteristic is community cohesiveness. These are enclaves of people who've lived there for a long time. They know each other, they support each other, there is a strong sense of community, and most of them believe in a little bit of wine at 5 in the afternoon, except in Loma Linda. And these communities live with purpose. They always have something to do. When they wake up in the morning, they know what's going to happen during the day, and yet there is a relaxed pace. And they put community and loved ones first. They're a very, very altruistic and giving type of society. And these characteristics are found in all of these blue zones. And there are some geographic characteristics of blue zones as well, but you'll notice that none of them really apply to Loma Linda. Most of them are isolated geographically on a peninsula or an island or a small town, and they have clean air. They're a long ways from industrial pollution, and all of these are near flowing water, fresh water. And most of them have limited mobility. They don't get outside of their community. Their community is self-contained. They take care of all of their needs. And as a result, they're not in a big rush. They have a relaxed pace. And they have a favorable agriculture and wine at 5. And you'll notice that Loma Linda has none of those. Loma Linda's in a busy valley. There's air pollution in Loma Linda much of the time. The water only comes from wells because the rivers don't run. There's excessive mobility up and down the freeways, Freeway 5, Freeway 10, all of the other freeways around Southern California. There's no relaxed pace in Loma Linda. It's a university setting. Everybody's got a deadline. There's very little agriculture there. There used to be orange groves nearby, and there was a farm at Loma Linda, but there's really very little agriculture there now. And they don't drink wine at 5. Yet, many of Loma Linda are physically active, and many of them do eat a plant-based diet. And Loma Linda is a blue zone because it is composed of a concentrated population of Seventh-day Adventists, and they all gather around Loma Linda University. But I think it is probably correct to understand that there is a small blue zone in every Seventh-day Adventist church. But that doesn't widely impact the health of the entire community, because in most places where we have churches, Seventh-day Adventists are in a minority, and therefore the health of the community is not greatly affected. But I can testify that in my own church here in Wilmington, North Carolina, it is a geriatric population. We've got a lot of people in their 80s and some in their 90s, and they take good care of their health, and it is a blue zone. Seventh-day Adventists are blue zone people, but we are not a cohesive group. We are actually very diverse. There are 1.2 million Seventh-day Adventists in the United States and 21 million worldwide. But Seventh-day Adventists in the United States we are the most ethnically diverse church. Perhaps we should say the most ethnically diverse denomination in the United States. We are 37% white, 32% black, 15% Hispanic, 8% Asian, 8% others. And our church, incidentally, is also very diverse politically. 45% of Seventh-day Adventists are Democratic in their leaning or lean that way. 35% are Republican, and about 20% are independent. The health message of the United States, the health message of Seventh-day Adventists actually has its roots in Joseph Bates. He was a sea captain, and he retired incidentally at the age of 35 and was an independently wealthy person at that point in time. But in his voyages, he gradually became a very temperate person. He stopped drinking alcohol in 1821. In 1823, he stopped tobacco. In 1828, he stopped drinking tea and coffee. In 1843, he became a vegetarian. And and he joined the Seventh-day Adventist people in 1845. And so he brought to the church all of these components of healthful living. And of course, the church adapted healthful living under the guidance of Ellen White. In 1848, she advocated stopping the use of tobacco and tea and coffee. And in 1854, advocated cleanliness and control of appetite. But the big boost among Seventh-day Adventists occurred the year of their incorporation, which was 1863. She had a strong health vision at that time and proclaimed that caring for health is a religious duty, that we needed to avoid alcohol, tobacco, highly spiced foods, and overwork. And she advocated a plant-based diet for the first time. And then in 1865, we established our first healthcare institutions. And the Seventh-day Adventist commitment to prevention has been captured in the acronym popularized by Weimar of New Start. And this is based on a quote from Spirit of Prophecy. And the Adventist lifestyle comprises nutrition, exercise, use of water inside and out, sunlight, not too much, temperance, avoiding alcohol, tobacco, and coffee, fresh air, rest, and adequate sleep and relaxation, and trust in God. There are others who have used the same quotation and come up with another acronym, another one popularized by Adventist Health in Florida, the Sunbelt version. They use creation, and it incorporates the same 8 characteristics. And then there's another one, celebration, that grabs the same elements as well. There are people who felt that Seventh-day Adventists were first studied by Dan Buettner, and that he was the one that told us that we were healthy people. This is not true. Seventh-day Adventists have been studied carefully for more than 70 years. The first Adventist health study was a mortality study conducted between 1958 and 1966 based on 23,000 Seventh-day Adventists in Southern California. And it was a case control study. The American Cancer Society was doing a big study at that time, and what we did is we matched every Seventh-day Adventist in the study with a Californian in the study, and they had to be the same age, same race, same gender, same occupation, live in the same community. So it became a valid case control study, and it was conducted by Frank Lemon and Richard T. Walden. And Frank Lemon lectured to me in preventive medicine when I was in medical school, as did Richard Walden. And I actually worked with Richard Walden in the School of Health for a period of time. And then, about the time I was getting my Master of Public Health at Loma Linda University, Roland Phillips was completing his Doctor of Public Health. And he came and to Loma Linda and developed Adventist Health Study 1, which enrolled 34,000 Californians. And he was assisted by Dr. Jan Kuchma, who was a biostatistician. And tragically, Dr. Phillips died in a sailplane crash in Redlands. On a foggy day, flew his sailplane into the side of the mountain and died tragically. And so then Dr. Gary Fraser came on the scene and started a nationwide study, started in 2002, and has, I think, right now over 92,000 Adventists, very close to 100,000 Adventists in the United States and Canada. And Dr. Gary Fraser just recently retired, and the study is now under the direction of Michael J. Orlick, and they have a staff of about 50 people working on it. The study is located at Loma Linda University, but very interestingly, it's funded by the federal government. The National Institutes of Health has poured tens of millions of dollars into the study, and it is because what they found in the first Adventist health studies. Adventists are the healthiest people in the United States. Adventists are the healthiest people in the world. And so if we want to preserve the health of our nation, it's important that we learn what makes Seventh-day Adventists so healthy, and then try to share that with the rest of the nation and the rest of the world. And of course, we know what it is that makes us healthy. Here is an example of some of the data from the mortality study, the first mortality study. And this shows life expectancy for men, comparing Seventh-day Adventist men with California men. And these men are matched, as I say, by age and occupation and residence. And you can see that at age 30, Seventh-day Adventist males live 51.9 years more on average, and California males 42.7 years. That's a difference of 9.2 years. And that's an amazing gain. And you can see at each age group, even coming up to age 70, Seventh-day Adventists still have a 5-year life expectancy advantage over other Californians. And at age 80, we still have a 4.6-year advantage. This is for California men. If you look at California women, they have an advantage as well, 7.5 years at age 30, and even at age 70, still a 6-year advantage. And you might say, well, that's not as dramatic as it was for men. And that is because California women of non-Seventh-day Adventists don't smoke as much as non-Seventh-day Adventist men. So non-Seventh-day Adventist females didn't smoke as much. So their advantage is not quite as great. But if we go back one, you'll see Adventist males live 51 years and Adventist females live 56. So females live longer than men anyway among Seventh-day Adventists and among the population in general. But it's this kind of life expectancy study that really propelled the U.S. government to take an interest in Seventh-day Adventists and to funnel money into the Adventist Health Study to look at it more and more closely. But now the first shades of blue zones, if you please, shows up even in the Seventh-day Adventist population. Because if you look at life expectancy, comparing Adventist vegetarians with Adventist non-vegetarians, in the 40 to 44 age group, on the left side, you can see that Adventists who are vegetarian have a 4-year advantage over Seventh-day Adventists that are not vegetarian. And even when you get to the 70 to 74 age group, Adventist males who are vegetarian still have a 2-year advantage over Seventh-day Adventist males who are not vegetarian. And so Seventh-day Adventists are the healthiest people in the United States, and they're also the healthiest people in every country where they have been studied. Here is life expectancy at age 20 in Norway, and you can see that Seventh-day Adventists in the dark blue column have a 5.2-year advantage over secular men rather. So here you have a 5.2, and the same is true for women. Seventh-day Adventist women have a life expectancy at age 20 of 64.2 years, and the non-Adventist women in Norway have a life expectancy of 59 years. So Adventist women have a 5.2-year advantage, as do Seventh-day Adventist men. And if you go to the Netherlands, you can see that Seventh-day Adventist men have an 8.9-year advantage and women have a 4.6-year advantage. If you go to Poland, men have a 9.5-year advantage and women have a 4.5-year advantage. And if you go to Japan, Japanese data is structured a little differently. But if you look at all-cause mortality of Seventh-day Adventists compared to non-Seventh-day Adventists, you can see that for all causes, we only have 66% of the mortality of Japanese people. We only have 46% of the mortality of Japanese people. And if you look at all cancers, we have we only have 55% of the cancer as to the rest of the Japanese population. So that adds up to a tremendous life expectancy advantage. And so if you look at a mortality ratio of Japanese men 40 and older, comparing Seventh-day Adventists with non-Seventh-day Adventists, you can see that we have only 65% of the mortality that non-Seventh-day Adventist men have. So that's a reduction in mortality of 45%. And so no matter where you go in the world, if you study longevity, Seventh-day Adventists come out on top. So if anybody says, who's the healthiest people in the world? It's not the Hunzas. It's not the Nepalese. It is Seventh-day Adventists. It's Seventh-day Adventists in the United States, Seventh-day Adventists in Europe, Seventh-day Adventists in Asia. No matter where they're studying, Seventh-day Adventists are the healthiest people in the world. That is a key message that is worth repeating in every community where you happen to work. Now, I want to switch to these studies of Seventh-day Adventists. And our lectures today and early next week will have to do with what we know about Seventh-day Adventists. And this is an article by Gary Fraser, Vegetarian Diets, what do we know about the effect on common diseases. And so what Dr. Fraser did was divide Seventh-day Adventists into 5 dietary groups. And so there are 5 different types of Seventh-day Adventists. The non-vegetarian Seventh-day Adventists comprise about 43% of our population, and they eat beef, red meat, they eat poultry and fish, and they eat dairy and eggs in addition to all the vegetables and fruits that they eat. And then Dr. Fraser has a group called semi-vegetarians, which is a bit of a misnomer, but you know, semi-vegetarians like being semi-pregnant. You know, either you're a vegetarian or you're not a vegetarian. But in the study, he was able to pull out about 8.3% of Adventists. And these people eat very little beef, and they eat very little poultry and fish, but they eat dairy and eggs. And then he has a group of pesco-vegetarians, which about 10% of Seventh-day Adventists. They don't eat red meat and they don't eat poultry, but they do eat fish and they do use dairy products. Then we have the lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and that comprises a large group of Adventists, about 34%. And they don't eat red meat, they don't eat poultry or fish, but they do use dairy products. And then there is a small but growing group among Seventh-day Adventists, the vegans, and they only comprise 4.3% of our population. But of course, they only eat plant-based products, and they don't eat red meat, poultry, fish, eggs, or milk or dairy products. So what we're going to be doing today and early next week, we're going to be looking at what do these people eat, these 5 groups of Seventh-day Adventists. So let's end how healthy are they? If we look at the risk of diabetes by diet, and if we make the rate of diabetes 1 for non-vegetarians, you see the semi-vegetarians have a real advantage. They've got almost a 30% decrease in diabetes. And the pesco-vegetarians have a 50% decrease in diabetes. The lacto-ovo-vegetarians have a further decrease, and the vegans have an almost 80% decrease in diabetes. So you can see that the prevalence of disease among Seventh-day Adventists varies tremendously by the type of diet that the Seventh-day Adventists are on. If we look at the risk of high blood pressure by type of diet, And if we make the amount of high blood pressure 1 for the non-vegetarians, the semi-vegetarians have about a 25% reduction in high blood pressure, pesco-vegetarians 40%, lacto-ovo-vegetarians 55% reduction in high blood pressure, and the vegans a 75% reduction in high blood pressure. If we look at obesity, and we're just going to look at BMI, and as you may, BMI stands for body mass index, and normal is considered 25 or less, so 18 to 25 is normal, and if the non-vegetarians as an entire group, their composite BMI is 28.3, semi-vegetarians it's 27, pesco-vegetarians 25.7, lacto-ovo-vegetarians 25.5, and as a group, the vegans BMI is 23.1. And so I would just make the observation that Seventh-day Adventist vegans are the only people as a complete whole who average a normal weight. There's a lesson there for us. But this is a little bit surprising. This is another paper, and this is called from the paper called Vegetarian Dietary Patterns and Mortality in Seventh-day Adventist Health Study 2, and this was an analysis of the data by Michael Orlick and the rest of his people, published in JAMA several years ago. And if you look at the risk of dying, the non-vegetarians have the highest rate. Semi-vegetarians are about 7% better. But you could lump the pesco-vegetarians, lacto-ovo, and vegans all together, and their mortality rate is reduced not quite 20%. And there's not a statistical difference between those three mortality rates, but obviously they are enjoying the healthiest diet. Now, what I'm going to do for the rest of this lecture, and we will expand on it in future lectures, we're just going to spend the rest of the time in this lecture on patterns of food consumptions among vegetarians and non-vegetarians. And this was published by Michael Orlick about 6 years ago, and it hasn't been widely noticed, but I have mined this one article and used it in dozens of graphs, and I hope you'll find it interesting. So let's take a look at red meat. And this is how Seventh-day Adventists eat red meat in grams per day. And you can see that the non-vegetarians eat 16 grams a day. The semi-vegetarians really don't eat very much red meat at all, only 1.6 grams. And of course, the pesco-vegetarians, the lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and the vegans don't eat red meat at all. But now let's look at heart attack and mortality for men by meat in the diet, and you can see the more frequently you eat meat, the more likely you are to have a heart attack, and your risk goes up 2.5 times if you eat meat every day compared to those who eat meat less than once a week. Risk of colon cancer almost doubles if you have red meat more than once a week. Risk of bladder cancer increases 2.3 times if you have meat, poultry, and fish in the diet compared to vegetarians. Ovarian cancer, 2.5 times increase. That's a 240% increase by having meat, fish, or poultry 1 or more times a week. Now let's look and see how Seventh-day Adventists do on poultry. And rather similar to red meat. The non-vegetarians, 21 grams a day, semi-vegetarians, 5 grams, and the other Adventist groups, none. And cancer mortality, cancer of the pancreas doubles if you have meat, poultry, or fish more than 3 times a week. This is among Seventh-day Adventists. Now let's look at fish. And here you can see that the non-vegetarians and the pesco-vegetarians eat a lot of fish. The semi-vegetarians don't eat very much, And of course, the lacto-ovo vegetarians and the vegans don't eat fish at all. Let's take a look at fake meats. And these come in a wide variety by Morningstar and by Loma Linda, formerly by Worthington. And then there are some minor producers, Cedar Lakes and others. And here is how Adventists eat fake meats. And it's interesting, isn't it, that the non-vegetarians eat the least amount of fake meats. And it goes up so that the largest amount is consumed by the lacto-ovo vegetarians. And the vegans evidently don't think very much of the fake meats either, because they only have 43 grams a day. Let's look at dairy products. And if we add up all the dairy products, you can see that non-vegetarians consume the most. Semi-vegetarians are a close second. Pesco-vegetarians eat less than the lacto-ovo vegetarians. And although vegans aren't supposed to be using dairy products, they evidently consume 2.1 grams a day. If we try to break this down, dairy products into whole milk, you can see that the non-vegetarians consume the greatest amount of whole milk, the semi-vegetarians less, and the pesco-vegetarians, the lacto-ovo vegetarians, consume about half the whole milk and whole milk products as the non-vegetarians do, and the vegans again come in with very little use of whole milk products. So what about low-fat milk? 2% fat, 1% fat in skim milk, and you can see the patterns are about the same. Your non-vegetarians and semi-vegetarians consume the most, and followed by the lacto-ovo vegetarians, the pesco-vegetarians, and the vegans don't use low-fat products at all. So what about cheeses? Well, isn't that interesting? The non-vegetarians and semi-vegetarians eat 25 grams a day, followed closely by the lacto-ovo vegetarians, so more or less by the pesco-vegetarians. And I think here that a lot of Adventists feel that cheese is a high-protein product, and because they don't eat meat, they should be eating more cheese. And this is not a wise move, but that's what Seventh-day Adventists do. And here's breast cancer mortality by cheese. If you eat cheese 3 times a week, you have a 40% increase in the risk of dying from breast cancer. And ovarian cancer, if you have cheese twice a week or more, you're twice as likely to develop ovarian cancer if you're a Seventh-day Adventist. Well, let's look at dairy desserts. Dairy desserts in grams per day. You can see that the non-vegetarians eat the most ice cream, followed by the semi-vegetarians, followed by the lacto-ovo vegetarians. Pesco-vegetarians don't eat quite as much. And of course, vegans, it looks like they don't eat ice cream. Then we come to butter, which is not a healthful fat. And the amount of real butter eaten per day, 3.9 grams for the non-vegetarians, and then it steps right down, and the vegans eat very little real butter. If you take a look at liquid fats, and these are certainly better for you than solid fats, especially if they're high in monounsaturated. And it's very interesting. The pesco-vegetarians and the vegans use the most liquid fat, and the lacto-ovos, semi, and non-vegetarians use a little bit less, but liquid fats are used fairly liberally by all dietary groups of Seventh-day Adventists. Then let's look at vegetables, which, of course, where the best amount of nutrition is. And you can see here that here the vegans and the pesco-vegetarian shine, eating more than 100 grams more per day than the non-vegetarians. But it's a little disappointing that the lacto-ovo vegetarians, they eat more, but not a whole lot more than the non-vegetarians. And if your vegetable intake is 3 or more per day, your risk of dying is decreased by about 25%. So we should be eating our vegetables every day. So let's look at fruit. Look at this. The vegans eat the most fruit. They eat not quite twice as much fruit as the non-vegetarians, but the pesco-vegetarians do very well with fruit as well. What about refined grains? And here we're talking about white flour and white flour products. And the daily average eating of refined grains is highest in the non-vegetarians and lowest in the vegans. And the vegans eat almost half as much refined flour and refined grain products as the non-vegetarians. What about whole grains? Just the opposite is true. Vegans eat twice as much whole grains as the non-vegetarians. But the lacto-vegetarians and pesco-vegetarians aren't doing a lot better. They could really do much better with whole grains. And the risk of colon polyps by the grams of fiber goes down. If you have 16 grams, your colon polyp risk is reduced by 30%. And of course, colon polyps are the precursors of cancer of the colon. Now, that always start in colon polyps. What about legumes? And aren't they beautiful? Legumes come in many different colors and sizes and shapes and are a good source of protein. And here you can see that the vegans eat much more legumes than the non-vegetarians, but the pesco-vegetarians eat more legumes than the lacto-vegetarians. Colon cancer by beans, peas, and lentils in the diet. If you have beans, peas, and lentils more than twice a week, your colon cancer risk is cut in half. So you should be eating beans, peas, and lentils at least twice a week. Pancreas cancer is cut by more than 50% by having beans, peas, and lentils at least 3 times a week. So we should be eating more beans, peas, and lentils. Hip fractures are reduced by 60% by eating beans, peas, and lentils daily. And they're reduced by 50% if you have them more than once a week but less than once a day. And here we have cancer mortality of the prostate. So this is a cancer of men, and you can see that if you have beans, peas, and lentils 3 times a week, the risk of prostate cancer is reduced by 50%. So we certainly need to recommend that everybody eat plenty of beans, peas, and lentils. What about nuts and seeds? Well, here, the vegans eat twice as much in terms of nuts and seeds as the non-vegetarians. As your diet improves, more and more admins are eating nuts and seeds. If we break them down to tree nuts, you can see that the vegans eat the greatest amount of tree nuts, followed by the lacto-vegetarians, followed by the pesco. And the non-vegetarians eat the least tree nuts. Nuts and heart attacks. You can see that if you have nuts 7 days out of the week, your risk of a heart attack is reduced by 41%. And if you look at fatal heart attacks by nuts and vegetarians, Adventists and non-vegetarian Adventists, you can see that both vegetarian and non-vegetarian can reduce their risk by at least 50% by eating nuts 5 days a week. If you eat them 1 to 4 days a week, the vegetarians have a big advantage, but the non-vegetarians don't. So if you're a non-vegetarian, you really ought to be eating a lot of nuts if you want to bring that risk of a heart attack down. And if we look at fatal heart attacks by obesity, you can see that even in those with a BMI greater than 24, if you eat your nuts 5 days a week, there is a 50% reduction in the risk of dying of a heart attack. But if you only eat them 1 to 4 times a week, you don't get a big boost. So if you're overweight, you really ought to be cramming those nuts in. What about peanuts? Well, very interesting. The vegans eat the least peanuts of Seventh-day Adventists. And the semi-vegetarians and the lacto-ovo-vegetarians eat just a little bit more. Everybody's eating a fair amount, 2.6 grams of peanuts a day, but it's fairly level, isn't it? But what if we look at peanut butter? And, well, look at that. The lacto-ovo-vegetarians eat more peanut butter than the vegans do. And this is also considered a source of protein. The pesco-vegetarians and the non-vegetarian Adventists eat less of the peanut butter. Then we come to citrus fruit. And look at that. The vegans eat more citrus than any other group. And citrus is particularly good for you. For men who eat citrus 5 times a week, nearly 50% reduction in prostate cancer. Lung cancer reduced by 25% by having citrus every other day. Then we come to berries. The vegans eat the most berries, followed by pesco-vegetarians. What about other fruits? The vegans come out winners again. 334 grams a day, followed by the pesco-vegetarians at 284 grams a day. The non-vegetarians eat the least amount of fruit. What about dried fruit? Dried fruit's very common in Southern California. And look at the vegans. They eat more than twice as much dried fruit as the non-vegetarians. And dried fruit's very good for you. The risk of cancer of the pancreas is decreased by 65% if you eat dried fruit 3 days a week. The risk of prostate cancer mortality is dropped by 50% by eating dried fruit 5 days a week. I have dried fruit every day. I'm 79 years old and I've never had cancer of the prostate. I hope I never do. Let's look at tomatoes. Wow, look at this. Non-vegetarians don't eat much in the way of tomatoes, whereas the vegans and the lacto-vegetarians eat a lot of tomatoes. Here's the risk of ovary cancer. Ovary cancer is reduced by 66%, 2/3, if you have tomatoes 5 days a week. So tomatoes prevent ovarian cancer. Let's look at leafy green vegetables. The pesco-vegetarians and the vegans eat the most green leafy vegetables. Overall mortality, your risk of dying is reduced by 33% if you have a green salad 7 days a week. There's nothing you can take or do that'll reduce your mortality that much compared to eating a green salad every day. What about salad dressings? Well, look at that. They're not particularly good for you. And so the vegans aren't very big on salad dressings, but the non-vegetarians are. Cruciferous vegetables, very important in preventing cancer. And the vegans eat more cruciferous vegetables, and the pesco-vegetarians do pretty good as well. Avocados. The vegans eat 3 times as much avocados as the non-vegetarians. What about sweet potatoes? Vegans win again. Vegans and pesco-vegetarians eat the most sweet potatoes. It's pretty flat otherwise. What about white potatoes? Well, the vegans come out ahead again, but the numbers are kind of getting closer together. What about French fries, fried potatoes? Non-vegetarians eat the French fries, followed by the semi-vegetarians, followed by the lacto-vegetarians. But even the vegans like fries now and then, don't they? How about soybeans and tofu? Not a surprise. Vegans eat close to 4 times as much tofu as the non-vegetarians. Pesco-vegetarians come in second. How about candy, sweets? Here you go. The non-vegetarians eat 5 times as much candy as the vegans do. But the lacto-ovos are doing too well themselves. How about snack foods, chips, pretzels, things like that? Fairly flat. Even vegans like their snacks, evidently. Beverages, sugary drinks. Non-vegetarians drink the most. Nearly more than twice, nearly 3 times as much. And soda, look at that. Vegans do very well, and the non-vegetarians don't do very well. Well, fruit juices made from real fruit, it's fairly level. Pesco-vegetarians drink the most fruit juice. And meal replacement drinks, yeah, non-vegetarians. These are things like Boost, Ensure, things like that. Vegans stay away from that, mainly because they're mostly dairy. Non-dairy milks, soy milk, the non-vegetarians stay away from that. The vegans are big on almond milk and soy milk and other similar milks. Looking at soy in particular, the vegans do very well. Drinking water. I'm going to stop right there because our time is up, and I'm going to pick this up in the next section because there's a big section on alcohol that I want to deal with, and so I'm going to stop the screen share there and ask you to take a 10-minute break, and we will be back at 3 o'clock. And we'll pick this up again at 3 o'clock.
All right. Welcome back. We are here with Dr. Adams, and we're here for the continuation of our session for today.
Thank you very much. And let's have a word of prayer again as we start this afternoon again. Heavenly Father, we ask for the Holy Spirit to help us understand and to see clearly how healthy people live, and to help us to live more healthfully so that we can be a better witness to others, so that we can enjoy better health, so that we may be more like you. And we look forward to the time when you will grant to us eternal life and eternal health, which we will enjoy throughout all eternity. Be with us as we continue our discussion on nutrition this afternoon. In Jesus' name, amen. So we were talking about beverages, and we discussed sodas, and now we're discussing water. And this is how Adventists drink water. The vegans drink the most water, followed by the semi-vegetarians, followed by the lacto-ovo-vegetarians. And water is extremely important for good health. In this study of Seventh-day Adventists, those who drank 5 glasses or more a day had a 54% reduction in the risk of fatal heart attacks. And those compared to those who drink less than 2 glasses a day. So drinking water is tremendously important for preventing heart disease. Now, we are advised in Spirit of Prophecy that we should discard, as Seventh-day Adventists, we should get rid of tea, coffee, tobacco, beer, wine, and all spirituous liquors are not to be taken moderately, but discarded. Get rid of them. So how do Seventh-day Adventists do? Let's take a look at coffee. And this is coffee in grams per day. It looks like all Adventists drink coffee, the most by the non-vegetarians and the semi-vegetarians. Even the vegans, some of them drink coffee as well in terms of grams per day, but they drink the least amount of coffee. And here is all-cause mortality for Seventh-day Adventist men by the amount of coffee consumed. And if you drink more than 3 cups a day, your risk of dying is doubled. And if you look at men 70 to 79, the risk is only increased by 70% because other things are going to be getting you. If you look at men 50 to 59 by the amount of coffee, there is a 270% increase in the risk of dying if you drink 3 cups a day or more, and increased by 230% for those 70 to 79. And if you drink none, your mortality is decreased. So let's talk a little bit about coffee. It turns out that there are literally thousands of studies on coffee, and most of them show that coffee doesn't affect mortality much at all. Some of them show a slight increase in mortality, some of them show a slight decrease in mortality, but overall it's a bit of a wash. And so why would coffee drinking be so deadly for Seventh-day Adventists? Why would it increase your risk of dying by, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60%? Heart attacks increase 270%. And it's just coffee is really bad for Seventh-day Adventists. So why would coffee be not so bad for people in the world, but coffee be really bad for Seventh-day Adventists? And I don't know all of the answer, except that I think that if you look at the relative contribution to mortality in a population that smokes and drinks alcohol and eats red meat and eats dairy products and eats a lot of cheese and is overweight and has high blood pressure and has diabetes, you throw in a cup or two or three or four or five a day, not going to make much difference because all of your other bad habits. But if you take Seventh-day Adventists, many of whom are in really good health, and even the non-vegetarians don't eat nearly as much meat as others. But if you take a group of really healthy people and then look at coffee drinkers versus non-coffee drinkers in that population, coffee is much more likely to show up as being harmful to health in that group compared to throwing coffee in to a group of people that are really sick to begin with. So let's look at tea. And here you have, I'm not sure they differentiated between caffeine tea and non-caffeine tea. So there may be herbal teas in here. And so teas are fairly level, except pesco-vegetarians seem to really like tea for some reason or other. So let's look at coffee, at alcohol drinks. And this is the percent. This is not grams per day now. This is the percent of current daily drinkers by food groups. And so of the non-vegetarians, 1.3% of them have an alcoholic drink every day. It's only 0.3% of the semi-vegetarians, 0.5% of the pesco-vegetarians, 0.2% of the lacto-overs, and only 0.1% of the vegans have a drink every day. But there are some vegans who do have a drink every day. What percentage never drink alcoholic drinks? Well, among the non-vegetarians, it is 83%, 92 for the semi, 92 for the pesco, 96 for the lacto-ovo, and 98.8. So almost 99% of the vegans never drink. But you can see even the non-vegetarian Seventh-day Adventists, 83% never drink an alcoholic drink. So to think that a lot of Adventists drink alcohol is really a misnomer. In general, more than 90% of us never use alcohol in any way, shape, or form. And we're reminded that whether we eat or drink, whatever we do, we should do all to the glory of God. And so these are the lifestyle elements that affect life expectancy: nutrition, obesity, emotional stress and attitude, tobacco, exercise, alcohol, our spiritual experience, our occupation, and environment. And so this has given you a glimpse of the healthiest people in the world, and you can see that they're not all the same, in fact, there's a great variation among Seventh-day Adventists, and I think that that's probably always been true. But I think it's clear that among Seventh-day Adventists, there are some very healthy people. And the vegans appear to have the better lifestyle compared to the non-vegetarian Seventh-day Adventists. So I'm going to switch to our second talk for today, and it'll just take me a second to get that one up. I'm going to put down the other PowerPoint slides and bring up, well, let me do it in a different way. So, all right. Now we're going to be looking at my book, The Healthiest People, The Science Behind Seventh-day Adventist Success. And we're going to start off by looking at chapters 3 through 6. So we're going to look at fruits, vegetables, and salads. And these are found on pages 21 through 62 of your textbook. We're going to start off by looking at citrus fruit in particular. And here is a graph showing you citrus fruit consumption among Seventh-day Adventists. And the vegans consume the most citrus fruit, and the non-vegetarians the least amount of citrus fruit. So what in the world is citrus fruit good for? And this is in grams per day. That's fruit, and this is citrus in particular. And again, the vegans eat the most fruit and they eat the most citrus. And here is prostate cancer by citrus fruit. If you eat citrus fruit 5 or more days a week, your risk of cancer of the prostate is reduced by 47%. I mean, that's fantastic. When you have a health program and they've got men in there, you can say you want to cut your risk of cancer of the prostate by more than 50% or about 50%. Start eating more citrus. Have it 5 days a week. Here is bladder cancer. Now, this study is not in Seventh-day Adventists, but this shows that if you have 94 grams of citrus in your diet every day per 1,000 calories, the risk of bladder cancer in women is cut by 50%. Here is the same study looking at fruit juice, and you can see that 59 grams of fruit juice a day reduces bladder cancer in women by 30%. Breast cancer. You don't usually think of citrus and breast cancer, but this is another large study, not done in Seventh-day Adventists, but it is done in China, and it was published in Nutrition and Cancer. And breast cancer risk can be reduced by 22% by eating 30 grams of citrus per day. Esophagus cancer. This cancer is going up in the United States. This is a meta-analysis of all of the epidemiologic studies available to date. And if you have a diet that has significant citrus in it, your risk of esophagus cancer can be lowered by 37%. Tremendous benefit. Lung cancer. Now, this kind of harks to one of the slides we looked at yesterday. But lung cancer can be reduced by having citrus 1 or more servings a week. You can cut the lung cancer risk by 25%. And of course, if you take the antioxidant out of the citrus and put it in a pill, then you'll increase your risk of lung cancer by 25 or 30%. Here's the risk of coronary heart disease by citrus. And you can see that the maximum benefit is obtained right in the middle there with 0.2 servings per day, which would be 1 or more servings per week on average. And so you achieve a maximum benefit at a fairly low dose. And this is a reduction in coronary heart disease in women by the amount of servings of citrus per day. So citrus, you can see, has benefits for lung cancer, bladder cancer, coronary heart disease, esophagus cancer, reduces the risk of coronary heart disease in men, and it seems to be the greatest benefit is in half a serving today, which is 1 serving every other day. So citrus is extremely good for you. Now, looking at chapter 4, apples, pears, and berries and dried food, pages 35 through 44. If we look at fresh fruit, you can see that the vegan Seventh-day Adventists eat the most fresh fruit. And They also eat the most berries, and they eat the most dried fruit. And the cancer of the pancreas with dried fruit is reduced by 65% by eating your dried fruit 3 or more times a week. Cancer of the prostate is dropped by 50% by eating dried fruit 5 days a week. And I limited this chapter to data from the Adventist Health Study. There are a lot of studies, and I looked at a number of them this morning, that show you the beneficial chemical compounds in berries. The dark berries are the ones with anthocyanins, and there's families of these chemicals, phytochemicals, that are so beneficial to health. And in my lectures to the public, I tend to not deal with beneficial chemicals or phytochemicals, because as soon as you do, somebody will find a pill that has anthocyanins in it or has phytochemicals in it. And from most of the studies that we have seen, if you take the chemicals out of the fruit and put it in a pill, it doesn't have the same properties that it does in the fruit. So in my lectures to the public, I tend to kind of ignore the studies that deal with the chemical issues and the beneficial chemicals and the antioxidants. Those are all nice studies, but I never want to see those in pills. I only want them in fruit. So I more or less try to confine myself to human studies. And this is a human study showing that if you eat raisin, dates, and dried fruit 5 days a week, your risk of cancer of the prostate is reduced by 50%. That's good news. And that's news that somebody can take home. If you talk about phytochemicals and how they're in fruit, they might go home and eat fruit, or they might go home and take a pill that has those phytochemicals in them. So now we're up to chapter 5. And this is vegetables, a foundation for a healthy diet. And if we look at vegetables in Seventh-day Adventists, you can see that the vegans eat the most vegetables, followed by the pesco vegetarians. And here is your chance of dying. Overall mortality is the risk of dying of all causes combined. And you can see that having vegetables even once a day drops your risk of dying by 18%. If you have 2 to 3 servings of vegetables a day, it drops it by 22%. If you have 3 vegetables a day, 3 servings a day, you drop it by more than 25%, 27% decrease in the risk of dying. And that's just phenomenal that vegetables are so protective and help you live a really long time. Here is the Adventists' consumption of cruciferous vegetables, and the vegans eat the most. White potatoes, vegans eat the most. Fried potatoes, vegans eat the least. And if we take a look and compare baked potatoes versus fried potatoes, let's just do a look at those 2 columns. The baked potatoes have more water because in the French fries, the water gets boiled out. The calories go from 97 calories per 100 grams up to 150, and that's because you've added fat. A baked potato by itself has very little fat, 0.13 grams, whereas your French fries have 5 grams. And if you look at sodium, your baked potato has some sodium, but not very much. It's a sodium-poor food. But by the time you add all of that salt to the French fries, you're up to 349 milligrams. Potassium, potatoes are a good source of potassium. And some of that is lost in the French fries. Calcium, some calcium in potatoes, and you lose them in the French fries. Vitamin A, there's a little bit in potatoes, not a great source of vitamin A, and you lose most of it by destruction by the heat in the French fries, and the same is true of vitamin C, and it goes down. Now this reference, the USDA National Nutrient Database, that is a wonderful resource, and I'll refer to it on another day, but that's where you can get all of these numbers. So if you want to compare apples and oranges or one kind of potato or another, you can go there and you can learn and compare the nutrients. And if we compare sweet potatoes versus white potatoes, you can see that the calories, they're both low-calorie foods. On the next line down, you can see that the sweet potato has more fiber, and the sweet potato, as expected, has more sugar because it's sweeter. It also has 3 times as much calcium. It has twice as much vitamin C, and when you get to beta carotene, just look at that. The sweet potato has almost 10,000 micrograms of beta carotene compared to white potatoes only having 1. And if you look at vitamin A, the sweet potato has 15,000 international units and the white potato only 2. So I'm not against you eating white potatoes, but you should certainly throw some sweet potatoes in there because they have a much broader spectrum of nutrition for you. If we look at sweet potato consumption among Seventh-day Adventists, you can see that the pesco-vegetarians and the vegans eat the most sweet potatoes, and they're enjoying better health as a result of that. If we take a look at tomatoes, the vegans and lacto-ovo-vegetarians eat the most tomatoes, and the risk of ovarian cancer, and I touched on this in the last section, risk of ovarian cancer by tomatoes goes down extremely fast. And you're down to, you've got a 66% reduction. And this is highly statistically significant. So eating tomatoes really helps women avoid ovarian cancer and can reduce the risk by 66% if you eat them 5 days a week. And now we come to salads. And we're going to finish this lecture fairly quickly here. Leafy green vegetables, the average consumption of leafy greens is highest in the vegans and next highest in the pesco-vegetarians. And here is overall mortality, your risk of dying based on green salads. If you have a green salad 7 days a week, you have a 33% reduction in the risk of dying. And there's not a pill you can take that will reduce your risk by 33%. But eating, this is for men and women, if you eat a green salad 7 days a week, 33% reduction in your risk of dying. And the tomatoes, we actually looked at this already, but the vegans and the lacto-ovo-vegetarians eat the most tomatoes. When it comes to avocados, which are high in fiber and high in good fat, the avocado consumption is about 3 times higher in the vegans, and we should all be eating more avocados. And that is the end of that lecture. And let me bring up the next one and see how long it is. We may be able to finish today in just 2 hours instead of taking all 3. Let me see how many slides I've got in this one. Yeah, okay. Let's continue on. Um, all right. So we're going to continue on and see if we can't finish this in the next 25 minutes. In The Healthiest People, The Science Behind Seventh-day Adventist Success, we're considering pages 63 through 78, which is chapter 7, Healthy People Go Nuts. And this is the average daily consumption of tree nuts among Seventh-day Adventists. And the non-vegetarian Seventh-day Adventists eat the least tree nuts, then it increases gradually, and the vegans eat a lot of tree nuts. I spent many years in Texas, and our most common nut there is pecans, so I eat pecans every day. In California, they eat almonds or walnuts, but I'm partial to pecans. When it comes to peanuts, the vegans eat the least peanuts. When it comes to peanut butter, it's fairly flat, but the lacto-vegetarians eat the most peanut butter. Now, we're going to be looking at a variety of slides to look at the relative risk of fatal heart attacks by frequency of nut consumption. And this is in Seventh-day Adventist. And if you eat nuts at least every day, your risk of a fatal heart attack is reduced by 60%. And there's not a pill. You can take a statin and take Crestor. It'll reduce your risk of a heart attack, but nothing will reduce your risk of a heart attack more than eating nuts every day. And this was first printed, and I'm showing you these heritage slides because this really woke the world up when Gary Frozer and his group published this back in 1992. He showed that the risk of a heart attack was reduced by 50% by eating nuts 5 days a week. And this was true for both men and women. So there's a 60% for men and a 50% for women if you eat nuts 5 days a week. And then they looked at young and old, and if you're less than 80, you can reduce your risk by 50% by having nuts 5 days a week. If you're over 80, you can reduce your risk of a heart attack by 50% by having nuts 5 days a week. If you look at vegetarian and non-vegetarian, the non-vegetarian can still reduce the risk of a heart attack by 50% if they eat nuts 5 days a week. If they have the 1 to 4 days a week, not so good. Whereas for vegetarians, 1 to 4 times a week, you get a 40% reduction, but then almost a 60% reduction. What about those who exercise and those who don't exercise? Well, if you exercise and eat nuts 5 days a week, that's the right-hand side, you can see you've got a 60% reduction in heart attacks, whereas if you don't exercise, you can eat all the nuts you want, it'll still help you, but you'll only get about a 35% reduction in the risk of a fatal heart attack. What about for obesity? And you can see that even for the obese, eating nuts 5 days a week has a 50% reduction in heart attack. Not so much if you eat nuts just 1 to 4 days a week. What about high blood pressure? Well, eating nuts 5 days a week works better for you if you have normal blood pressure. But if you have high blood pressure and eat nuts 5 days a week, you can at least have a 20% reduction in the risk of a heart attack. And this brings out a very important point, and that is that good behaviors overcome the bad effects of bad behavior to some degree. So if you have high blood pressure, you can blunt the effect by eating nuts. but it works better for you if you control your blood pressure and eat nuts. So good health habits are additive, but good health habits will overcome the harmful effects of bad health habits to some degree. So what kind of nuts did they eat in this study? Well, in the original study, they didn't know because they just asked people about nuts. So they had to go back and do a survey of these people in California. 32% ate peanuts, 29% almonds, 16% walnuts, 23% something else. And so let's look at the macronutrients for various nuts. And here we're going to compare almonds, walnuts, pecans, and pistachios. And you can see in the first column, protein varies quite a bit. Pecans have the least protein, almonds have the most. In terms of fat, pecans have the most. In terms of saturated fat, almonds have the least. And let's jump over to the monounsaturated, which is probably the best fat. And pecans are highest in monounsaturated, followed by almonds. And the carbohydrate content of nuts is actually fairly low. And this is another chart that looks at the same thing. Here we're looking at 1 ounce portions of nuts, which is 28 grams. And these nuts were all dry roasted without salt. So they were dry roasted, no salt. This is the plain nut, but they are roasted. And you can see that the calories are about the same. Macadamias have a few more calories. Protein is highest in pistachios here. Fat is highest in macadamia. Saturated fat is fairly low. Monounsaturated is highest in macadamia, followed by pecans. Polyunsaturated fat is highest in pecans. When you look at minerals, magnesium is highest in cashews. And let me just take a detour here and say that there are many people that are deficient of magnesium, and I'm always highly amused to see them take magnesium tablets. And magnesium in nuts is absorbed because the magnesium is bound to protein and bound to amino acids, and you get it into your body. But magnesium in a pill is not well absorbed. You have heard of milk of magnesia. That's magnesium oxide. What is it? It's a laxative. It'll give you diarrhea because it goes right through you. Magnesium sulfate is Epsom salts. Take a tablespoon of that. You'll have diarrhea. Clears you out because magnesium is not absorbed from magnesium sulfate, magnesium oxide, magnesium chloride. Magnesium is absorbed best when it's combined with a vegetable source. So we look next at potassium. Cashews have the most potassium. Look at sodium. None of them have sodium. Now, at this point, a lot of people ask the question, what about dry roasted versus oil roasted? And what I have here are a comparison of pecans. These are all pecans. But in the first one, they're dry roasted with no salt. And the next column is dry roasted but salted. The next column is they were roasted in oil but no salt. And the next one, they were roasted in oil and salt was added. So let's look at the calories. It's the same all the way across. Protein, it's the same all the way across. Total fat, it's the same all the way across. Saturated fat, the same. Monounsaturated, the same. Polyunsaturated, the same. Magnesium, about the same. Potassium, it drops a little bit when you roast them. And sodium goes up a lot when you add salt. But the point is, in terms of adding fat, dry roasting or oil roasting makes no difference whatsoever. So don't let somebody say, oh, you should eat them dry roasted. Roasting adds a lot of oil. It doesn't add any oil. Roasting a nut in oil is like throwing mud on a pig. A pig doesn't get dirtier if you add mud to it because it's got more mud on it than you could add anyway. Nuts are very high in fat. So if you roast them in oil, you're not adding any fat whatsoever. Now let's look at a couple of studies of nut and nut butter consumption and the risk of diabetes in women. This is not a study of Seventh-day Adventists. It's a study of nurses, 83,000 women from 11 states, ages 34 to 59. They all started out healthy, no diabetes, heart disease, or cancer, and they were followed for 16 years. And if they had nuts 5 times a week or more, the risk of developing diabetes during that time was reduced by 45%. So the more nuts you eat, the less likely you are to develop diabetes. Now, let's break it down by obese women and normal women. The normal women are blue, and they eat their nuts, and they're not obese. And you notice that in the obese women, eating nuts 5 days a week reduces the risk of diabetes by 25%, but in the normal women, it reduces it by 45%. So it brings out the point that a good habit, to some extent, overcomes the harmful effect of a bad habit. And it certainly shows up in the risk of diabetes in women. And if we look at these same women by exercise and look at nut consumption in the red bars, women who don't exercise, you can see that eating nuts 5 days a week decreases the risk of diabetes by 18%. But if you exercise 5 days a week, it reduces the risk of developing diabetes by, 37%. And so this shows again that good habits are additive. Exercising and eating nuts is better for you than eating nuts and not exercising. And the risk of developing diabetes by eating nuts and whole grains. So the blue bars are for women that eat 2 or more servings of whole grains a day and nuts. And you can see that if they eat the whole grains and eat nuts 5 days a week, the risk of developing diabetes is reduced by 57%, showing again that good habits are additive. But even if you don't eat your whole grains and you do eat your nuts 5 days a week, your risk of diabetes is reduced by about 20%. So the authors conclude higher nut consumption of nuts and peanut butter was associated with lower risk of type 2 diabetes in this large cohort study of women. Our data combined with other clinical and epidemiological data support potential benefits of increasing nut consumption and reducing type 2 diabetes risk. Now we're going to look at nut consumption and sudden cardiac death in the Physician's Health Study. This is not Seventh-day Adventist. This is in 22,000 male physicians who were between 40 and 82 in 1982. And these were all healthy, no history of heart attacks, strokes, TIAs, or cancer. And their cardiovascular history was updated every year. And nut consumption was documented in terms of frequency and amount. And the end point is when you drop dead suddenly. And so they divided the nuts, and these people didn't eat much nuts. So the categories are rare, 1 to 3 times a month, 1 time a week, or more than twice a week. And they had more than 4,000, they had almost 5,000 people in each group. And the age was about the same in each group, and the cholesterol was about the same in each group. The vegetables were the same in each group. The fruit was a little more in those that ate more nuts, and the weight was the same in all of the group. So what happens? Risk of sudden death is dropped by 36% if you eat nuts more than twice a week. So non-Adventists have proved exactly what Adventists did, but Adventists came up with a study first, and then others did a study to try it out. Now, this is a study that I added in just today, and it looks at metabolic syndrome and obesity, and it is from the Adventist Health Study. And this is a somewhat more recent study. The metabolic syndrome has 5 components to it. One is abdominal obesity, next is high triglycerides, next is low HDL cholesterol, next is high blood pressure, and next is elevated blood sugars. And if you have any 3 of those, then you have the metabolic syndrome. And if you have the metabolic syndrome, it doubles your risk of heart attacks and strokes, but it increases your risk of developing diabetes 500%, which is 5-fold. And what we're going to be doing here is we're going to be comparing tree nuts with peanuts. Which nut is better for you? Are tree nuts better than peanuts? And so in the first column, we're looking at people that didn't eat very many tree nuts and didn't eat very many peanuts. And in this category, there were 284 Seventh-day Adventists. Their average age was 53, 189 females, 95 males, 116 whites, 168 blacks. Then the next category are people that ate a lot of peanuts but very few tree nuts, 110 in this group, and you can see how they are divided. The third category are people that eat large amounts of tree nuts and large amounts of peanuts, and there were 242 in that group. And the last group are the people that eat a lot of tree nuts but not very many peanuts. And let's see how this plays out. So if we look at the prevalence of obesity, and if we make the rate of obesity 1 in those that were low tree nut and low peanut, you can see that if you eat a lot of peanuts, your risk of obesity is reduced by 11%. But if you throw in tree nuts and eat a lot of tree nuts and a lot of peanuts, your risk of obesity is reduced by 33%. But if you eat a lot of tree nuts but not very many peanuts, your risk of obesity is reduced by 46%. And so don't let people tell you that nuts are fattening. Nuts are high in fat, but nuts are not fattening. And nuts are good to include in the diet if you're not obese, because it will help prevent obesity. But in preventing obesity, tree nuts are better than peanuts. And so this is a very unique and refined point that comes out of the Adventist Health Study. And the metabolic syndrome, if you look at that by tree nuts, you can see that those who don't eat much in the way of nuts at all are more likely to have the metabolic syndrome. And if you have tree nuts and peanuts, you can reduce it by more than 30%. And here, the most favorable group are those with high tree nut and high peanut. They can avoid the metabolic syndrome. So we should all eat more nuts. Now we're going to look at legumes. Legumes, Seventh-day Adventists, the vegans and pesco-vegetarians and the lacto-ovo-vegetarians eat the most legumes. And this is colon cancer by beans, peas, and lentils. It's reduced by nearly 50% if you have this more than twice a week. Cancer of the pancreas, reduced almost 60% in those who eat beans, peas, or lentils at least once to 3 times a week. Prostate cancer can be reduced 50% by eating beans, peas, and lentils 3 times a week. Hip fractures, and this is interesting because beans, peas, and lentils are high protein foods. And we know that if you eat a lot of red meat, if you eat a lot of dairy products, the risk of hip fractures goes up. And that's because of the strong acids in those, and we can discuss osteoporosis later on if you wish. But the concern was if Adventists ate a lot of protein in terms of beans, peas, and lentils, perhaps their risk of hip fracture would go up. But the opposite is true. If you eat beans, peas, and lentils daily, your risk of a hip fracture is actually decreased by 64%. Amazing. So beans in the diet will lower your cholesterol, your total cholesterol. It will also lower your LDL cholesterol. It will lower some markers of inflammation, and we discussed that a little bit the other day. And some of the markers that are commonly measured are interleukin-6, tissue necrosis factor alpha, and C-reactive protein. And if you eat beans, peas, and lentils, it reduces these factors in your bloodstream. And beans, peas, and lentils will help you reduce your appetite, helps you lose weight. And polypeptide tyrosine is a chemical circulating in the bloodstream. The higher it is, the more full you feel. And the same is true of oxyntomodulin and ghrelin. These are all hormones in the body that the body makes, and if these are elevated, your appetite goes down, and beans affects these in such a way that your appetite goes down. And so I'm going to stop the screen sharing there, and we have gotten through all 3 lectures in 2 hours, so we've done well. And so if there's some questions, we could take a question. But if not, we'll actually call it quits for today and quits for the week. And we can pick this up again next week with the next chapters in the book.
It doesn't look like we have any questions. So without further ado, we can close in prayer.
We will see you next week.
All right.
On Monday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. God, Father in heaven, thank you so much for this day and your blessings and allowing us to be here. Lord, thank you for this lecture. May you carry this with us, I pray in your name. Amen.